Welcome, everyone, to our next episode of Agile Insights Conversation. Today, I have the pleasure to have two amazing women joining me. One is Kim Scott, the author of Radical Candor and Just Work, her latest book. The other one is my coach, Shani Ospina, who will help me out on this interview today. So, thank you both for joining here. Now, whenever we run these conversations, I always find it weird, I don't know why, that I introduce others. But I like to give some space and time to others to give a short introduction about themselves. And Kim, today, as you are our interviewee, basically, we want to engage in a conversation with you. I would love to start with you. Can you share a bit about yourself with us before we get the conversation started?
Sure. So my whole business career was one giant plan to subsidize my writing habit, and it's finally working. So mostly I'm a writer these days. But I started two companies, Just Work and Radical Candor, that help teams and leaders put the ideas in those books into practice. I co-founded Radical Candor with Jason Rosoff, and I co-founded Just Work with Trier Bryant, and who was born in Trier, Germany. I don't know if you've been there, but not too
Yes,
far from
many
Cologne.
times.
And I also, before that, I worked at Google and I worked at Apple. So, and before that, I did three startups, all of which failed. So, Google and Apple worked out better for me. And in that period of time, the thing that I really loved more than anything else was building great teams. So, I also became, like Shani, a CEO coach. And that's me in a nutshell.
That's you in a nutshell. Thank you, Kim. Shani, a few words about you because our most of our audience doesn't know you. And I frequently talk about you, but some of them or many of them haven't met you yet.
Yeah, no, very briefly. So I'm an executive coach. I've been an executive coach for 15 years. I work primarily with C-level executives, I would say increasingly in the sort of SME space, startup space, although I've done a lot of corporate work as well. I originally started my career in strategy consulting. I did a little stint in finance, and here I am for the last 15 years doing what I absolutely love. And Saurabh, of course, you're one of the people who has either benefited or been a victim of of my work.
Both, both. No, I wouldn't be working with you for 2+ years if it hadn't benefited me so far. So thank you both for this quick introduction. Now, Kim, I got to know you through the first book I think that you wrote,
Mm-hmm.
being Radical Candor. And Shani and I have been using a lot of the tools that you put in there in the work that we do together. And then I read your second book. And I must say, I mean, this conversation is not going to be a summary of the book. We don't want to spoil anything for people that are interested. We actually want to spark more interest. But I started reading that book, and you talk about a time in your life when I think you began your career and a few of the challenges, let's put it mildly, that you went through. And I was reading that and I was thinking about my own upcoming, like growing up, being an immigrant kid, always feeling being at a disadvantage. And then reading what you wrote, I was like, oh man, I've never gone through what she has gone through just because I'm a man. And suddenly I felt so privileged on the one hand. And on the other hand, I was like, and Kim is pointing out that she is privileged as well. So, what must other people go through that don't have my privilege of being a man or don't have Kim's privilege of growing up in the US and being like white collar, all of that? So, can you share with us a bit about the things that happened early on in your career and that drove you do the work that you've been doing, become the person that you are, and share all of these insights and the wisdom that you have now with all of us out there?
Sure, absolutely. And I think you raised such an important point. When I co founded Just Work, the company with Trier Bryant, and Trier's a Black woman, and English is her third language. So I remember talking to her saying, look, about my own privilege. And she said, look, it's not a contest over we've all gone through stuff. And the point is, when we come together in solidarity, then we can solve these problems. So so anyway, here are some of the things that happened in my very first job out of college. I started working at a financial management company, and I learned that I was getting paid like dramatically less than the market. And I went to my boss and I talked to him about it, and he said, "Well, you have to talk to the CEO." And he didn't think I would talk to the CEO, but I did. I went in and I talked to him, and immediately he got angry with me and started yelling at me like, if I paid you that much, then you'd get paid more than my daughter. And his daughter was a grade school teacher, and grade school teachers are dramatically underpaid and they should be paid more. But the solution to that is not to pay women in finance less than men in finance. The solution to that is to pay teachers more. And so, but at the time, I can sit here and say that very logically, but at the time, I felt gaslit. I felt like, oh my gosh, he's yelling at me. He's actually really angry. Maybe I did something wrong. And it was eating me up. It was like one of those things that would wake me up at 4 in the morning. And so I talked to other people about it. In fact, I went to talk to his chief of staff about it. And the chief of staff said, "Well, why don't we have dinner together?" And I thought that was a little weird. He's like, "I'm too busy to talk about it right now, but we'll have dinner together." And then we were working in Moscow, and he couldn't get a reservation. So he said, "I'll just bring dinner to your apartment," which also was a little weird. But anyway, he wound up grabbing my breast at one point in the dinner, and I had to like run out of my own apartment. It was this sort of weird moment where I felt like I am safer alone on the streets of Moscow than I am in my own apartment. And that was strange realization. But during Me Too, I remember reading some stories about women who are attacked in their own homes. And as I was reading these stories, I was like, just leave, just run away, you know? But where that insight came from, I don't know. And it wasn't the only time that happened to me. Actually, I was telling the story to a friend of mine. Now I'm digressing a little bit, but I was telling this story to a friend of mine over dinner, and my husband was sitting there, and she also had a story where she had run out of her own house into the streets in the middle of the night to get away from some guy. And his jaw was on the table. He said, "Does every woman have a story about running away, running out of her?"
Mhm.
I said, "Unfortunately, a lot of us do." He couldn't believe it. It was like your experience reading the book. Anyway, so that happened. And then I wound up talking about the situation to my boss's boss, not the CEO, but I went, and he didn't solve the problem, but he got me a little bit of a raise. And I was very grateful to him. He was someone I had sort of come to think of as a mentor, as someone I could trust. And at one point we were on a business trip in St. Petersburg, and my boss had just kind of grabbed the newspaper away from me, and he was like, "Directors read first." And I was upset about it, and so I just kind of walked away. I went to the elevator. I was going up to my room, and my boss's boss followed after me and said, "Gosh, he was really awful to you there." And we got in the elevator, the doors closed, and he kind of reached out his arms for a hug. And I hugged him mostly because I was sort of tearing up and I was ashamed. I didn't want him to see that I was crying. And then he started to fraught me, to grind himself into me. And, and the door opened and I ran away. Uh,
Again, running. Yeah.
once again, darted under his arm. And, and I remember just feeling so devastated and alone at that point. Like the one person I felt like I could trust in all of this turned out to be so untrustworthy. And then but it wasn't all bad. There was one other person I told who was also a partner at the firm, and he finally called me and he said, "Look, you got to get out of there." And he was the one who introduced me to the next company where I worked. So there's and the value of him doing that was both psychologically crucial, but also at a practical level crucial, because somehow when you're in these situations, at least when I was in that situation, I felt stuck. I felt trapped. I felt like I couldn't leave. I wasn't allowed. I don't know why I felt like I wasn't allowed to quit, but I did. I was so determined, not, that I was going to succeed at this company. And he was the one who said, there are other jobs, Kim. And I needed to hear that. And he didn't just say there are other jobs, he made an introduction for me. But also, even before he had done that, just his willingness to acknowledge this is wrong, this is not right, and I'm sorry, dispelled a lot of the gaslighting and made me feel less alone. So, part of the reason why I wrote Just Work is in gratitude to the upstanders, the many upstanders in my career, and also to help other people realize how important it may seem inadequate to just say, gosh, I saw that happen, I noticed that happen, and it's wrong, but that is really can be extending a lifeline to someone.
So, how do you go from all of these things that happen to you? And I can identify with a lot of them. Like like all women, and I've had my share of those. But how do you go from there to actually saying, you know what, I really need to help other people deal with this, and I need to help myself deal with this.
Yeah. It's kind of hard for the author of a book called Radical Candor to admit, but I was in denial about a lot of this stuff. I think I dealt with it too often by pretending like it wasn't happening and just marching forward. And and I think I had a moment shortly after Radical Candor came out when I was giving a Radical Candor talk at a tech company in San Francisco. And the CEO of that company was someone I like and respect enormously. So I'd worked with her for the better part of a decade, and one of too few Black women CEOs in tech. And she pulled me aside afterward and she said, Kim, I'm excited about Radical Candor. I'm excited to roll it out. I think it's going to help me build the kind of culture I want. But she said, I got to tell you, it's much harder for me to roll it out than it is for you. And she explained to me that as soon as she would offer anyone even the most gentle, compassionate criticism, she would get slimed with the angry Black woman stereotype. And I knew this was true. And as soon as she said it to me, it sort of helped me realize four things at the same time. The first was that I had not been the kind of upstander that I want to be. I had not been the kind of colleague that I imagined myself to be. I had failed even to notice the extent to which she had to show up unfailingly cheerful and pleasant at every single meeting we had ever been in together. And and that was, I hadn't even considered the toll that must take on her, the mental tax that must cost her. So that was number one. The second thing I realized in that moment was that I had been in denial about the kinds of things that were happening to me, and that if I was gonna address them, I needed to come out of denial. I needed to be able to notice reality. And the third thing I realized was that, I think part of the reason I had been in denial is I never wanted to think of myself as a victim. We have such a strange response to being a
Yeah.
victim in our society. But even less than wanting to think of myself as a victim, did I want to think of myself as a perpetrator. And yet that was the third realization, was that I had sometimes said or done things that were biased, that were unfair to others, and I'd been even deeper in denial about those moments. And then the fourth thing I realized was that as a leader, even though I often thought I was creating these wonderful bullshit free zones, these great work environments, I had failed to address bias, prejudice, and bullying adequately to create really great work environments. And so I think that was the moment when I realized I've got to sit down and write this book, Just Work, and to help others, and to help others no matter what their role is, because sometimes we're going to play all four of those roles. Sometimes we're the victim, sometimes we're the perpetrator. And it's tricky, by the way, writing a book for both sides, but it seemed important to do that. Sometimes we observe it and we want to be the upstander, but we're the silent bystander, and sometimes we're the leader. And I think a lot of leaders make mistakes, and I think in some ways, it was safer for me to admit the mistakes I had made as a leader than it would be if I were a man, for example. So I felt like I was in a decent position to write this book.
Yeah. So you mentioned San Francisco and the tech hub there. I remember almost 10 years ago, I got the chance to tour the Dropbox offices.
Hmm.
And Dropbox's slogan back then, I don't know if it's still the case, was "It just works."
Yeah.
So I was touring their office, and they had this one booth where people could go in and jam. And above that, they had this like "It just works." And the person who gave me the tour said, sometimes we turn off the "it" and the "s" at the end. So it's just work. And that
Really?
helps people to focus, right? To get shit done.
Yeah.
And based on that experience, when I saw your book, when I saw your book title, thinking also about radical candor, which to me mostly was about, so how can we get work done, right?
Yeah.
The first interpretation I had of the title was, so this is another book that helps us to just work, like get work done. And although it's on the title, right, get shit done, that was what I read, fast and fair. I
Yeah.
completely skipped that until I was like in chapter 2, I think, or something like that, where I realized, no, 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 that's just one aspect of it.
Yes.
The other aspect is really more about the fairness piece,
Yeah.
about
Justice.
creating this environment where people feel included, where you create like psychological safety, another one of these like big terms that comes up. And actually, if you do those things, then you get to that just work that I was
Yeah.
initially interpreting. So this, and now you going through your journey as an executive initially, as a coach, now as an author, did you also start primarily with this focus on how can we get work done so that our organization becomes more productive? And then later on, working with the teams, you mentioned your passion for that, realize that, hey, that's the wrong focus. I need to get other things right in order to get there. But that's an outcome that I will get once I get those other things right. Did you go through a similar process that I did, or?
So in the course of my career, the reason why I like to write and the reason why I like to be a manager boils down to the same thing is I'm really curious about what are the conditions that are required for each of us to become our best selves. And to live life both joyfully and productively. And to me, if I don't feel productive, I'm not going to feel joy. Like work and life are very much integrated, and they're not at war with each other. And in some ways, I was, as we were chatting before this started, I said I started my career in Moscow. That was where I first started working in Russia. And I remember one time I took a train ride from Moscow to Paris, and I just was sitting staring out the window, and it was like a lesson in economics and in systemic injustice, frankly, just looking out the window. Because, and it was still the Soviet Union at this point. This was 1990. And you got on the train, and it was great. There was no food. Like, you had to, I remember, like, I had to buy a bag of tangerines that had come from Cuba, and there was this joke that these tangerines were traded for missiles, and they were the most expensive tangerines. And like, the whole economy was so, you couldn't buy toilet paper in Moscow at that point. Like, you'd walk into the grocery store, there was no food, and there was certainly no dining car on the train. So you got on this train, and then you looked out the window, and as you pull out of Moscow, things are just a mess. Things are a hot mess. Things are dilapidated. And then as you're going west, things start to get a little more orderly and a little bit nicer. And then you pull into Poland, and things are way better. And then you pull it, and then and then you're in Germany, and then you pull in. I'll never forget getting off the train car in Paris, and there were all these, sleek silver Western European cars, but I was still in this Soviet train car, which is like was it was like something out of a cartoon. It was green and filthy, and there were flies. And I was like, oh my goodness, like one of these systems works way better than the other system. So part of it is like a systems thinking thing, like what, and then also thinking about how unhappy I was when I was in Moscow at that time. I was at Moscow Physical Technical Institute, which is where the nuclear scientists were trained. I remember one guy like grabbing his head and rocking back and forth and saying, my brain, like I'm expected to do this significant scientific work, but I can't, I've been taught not to think. I've been taught, that I've been taught to believe lies. And it's interfering in my ability to do physics. And that moment was like so intense for me. But luckily, that guy is living in Atlanta, Georgia now. He's not in Moscow, and he's horrified by the war. But I think that so that got me to thinking like what how do we create environments, and obviously in the workplace things aren't usually as unjust as they were in the Soviet Union. But I did have the experience early on of working at companies where people were treated horribly. um, where I remember one time I was working at a company that had to do layoffs, and the CEO was afraid to do it himself. So he hired a paid asshole to come in and fire everybody in the worst possible way. And I remember thinking, these layoffs are necessary, but the difference between doing it well and doing it poorly is the difference between the the self-respect that the people who got laid off have, and also the motivation that the people who stay, because it was done so badly, everyone who wasn't fired sort of had survivor guilt and wasn't able to do their best work. So it was both unjust and unproductive, this kind of asshole management. And I think too often I've been thinking a lot about this because of the war and sort of the contrast in Zelensky's leadership and Putin's brutality. And I think too often we do, when it comes to our attitudes and behaviors about management, we do have this sort of false belief that I call it the sort of totalitarian mindset, that a boss has to be an authoritarian asshole, and I just don't believe that's true. I don't think it's effective, and I don't think it helps people do their best work, and I don't think it helps create either a productive or a fair atmosphere. So that's a long-winded answer to your question.
Oh, thank you for that. Now, just to pick up on this, and then Shani can ask the next question. I think one of the reasons we have this belief, or many people have this belief, that a true leader, a strong leader, right, is this totalitarian asshole, is that many people looking at some of the more famous and successful leaders, being Steve Jobs, being Elon Musk, being Jeff Bezos, they only point out the weaknesses of these people, and they rarely point out the genius. I think I never got the chance to meet any of them in person, but just looking at Elon, how many companies he's able to run in parallel, and those people working there like doing an amazing job. I don't believe that he could create an environment that is like completely toxic. I might be wrong, but I think we hear too often the bad sides of these people, and everybody has weaknesses and strengths. And then some leaders believe, okay, in order to be like Elon, I need to be like this kind of asshole, or whatever. It's
Yeah.
just an observation that I've had with many leaders working with. And I think pointing out the other things can help people, as you did, right? To show better behavior and still be very effective and very
Yeah.
determined.
Yeah. I mean, look, it's hard to argue with success. I would say I did work at Apple, and I did have the opportunity to observe Steve Jobs' leadership. And I think there was a lot of humanity there that doesn't get talked about. I mean, for example, it was very clear. You would see Steve Jobs and Johnny Ive having lunch in the, they just had lunch in the cafeteria, sitting at a table like everybody else. And they clearly, you could just tell from these two people loved working together. They enjoyed each other. There was, when Steve Jobs was diagnosed with cancer, Tim Cook offered to give him his liver, part of his liver, and Steve Jobs refused the sacrifice. Like, there is no way to explain that kind of behavior other than love. And these two people really loved working together and loved each other. And that's the kind of stuff that doesn't get talked about very often. Um, I probably would not have enjoyed working directly for Steve Jobs because it would have been rough, but other people liked it. And the point is that he surrounded himself with people whom he had a real human relationship with. Scott Forstall, who built the iOS team, adored Steve, really, viewed him as a mentor. And it was clear that those two people really cared about each other. And I think that very often at the center of a successful company are good relationships between a CEO and their direct reports. And uh, I don't think it gets talked about because it's very difficult. You can't operationalize that. It's going to be different. There's no one way to have a good relationship.
There's no
Uh,
framework for that.
yeah, there is. I did build a framework for it, but it's going to look very different. And in fact, radical candor between Steve and Johnny Ive looked very different from radical candor between Steve and Scott Forstall, looked very different than radical candor between Steve and other people who he worked with. So it's sort of universally human. It's about love and truth at the same time, care personally, challenge directly. But it's also about, it's relative. It's culturally relative and it's interpersonally relative.
Yeah. Thank you, Kim.
It's fascinating to sort of hear about these leaders that people idolize or hate depending on where they stand, and kind of to actually realize that it's always a bit more subtle
Yeah.
than it's presented. However, bringing it back to kind of, let's call it the common person, right? Because most of the people that we are surrounded by are not going to be reporting into Steve Jobs or even one of Steve Jobs' direct reports, right? And many of them are also potentially earlier on in their career and different levels of disadvantage. And so I was struck by the insights in your book and the fact that you constantly say, look, here are options for how you can respond. But I was also thinking, God, it would take a lot of courage, depending on my circumstances, to to go into some of these responses. And they seem like exactly the right thing to do. And now, 20 years into my career, I could see myself doing that. But I don't think I would have been able to do it when I was 4 or even 1 or 5 or even 10 years into my career. And so I'm wondering, what would you advise people, or what would you say to people and say, well, how did you get the courage?
Yeah. Look, I was raised as a woman, as a girl in the South, as a child, and I was taught never to push back, ever, 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 and never to criticize, and always, never say no, and all the things you have to do, and that made it hard for me as a leader. I think the thing that helped me more than anything else to realize that it was the right thing to do was to be very clear in my own mind about what happened when I didn't do it. What happened, and because what I didn't want to lose was my desire to be kind. Like, that was core to who I was. I had a mentor early on in my career who said, look, you may not love where you are at this moment in your career, and honestly, very few people love where they are in their first it's like your first jobs are going to suck. I'll just put it that way, unless you're exceptionally lucky. So you may not love where you are, but you can use this as an opportunity to respond to the situation you find yourself in a way that helps you become the person you want to be. And so that was very helpful to me to realize, okay, I am me now, and I want to respond to the things that are happening to me in a way that helps me become the person I want to become. So that was helpful. The other thing that really helped was thinking about, okay, what are those moments when I didn't respond? What are those moments when I just was silent, when I could have spoken up, or in retrospect, I wish I had spoken up, but I didn't? And what happened? So in Radical Candor, I tell the story of this guy, Bob. And I liked Bob a lot. He was smart, he was charming, he was funny, but he was doing terrible work. And because I wanted to be nice to Bob, I didn't say anything, you know. And then 10 months later, I wound up having to fire him. Not so nice after all. And so I write the whole story in great gory detail in the book. But remembering Bob when I was tempted not to say the thing to someone was really helped me to find the courage to say it. The other very small thing I would do is before I would go into a conversation with someone, I would write down what are the three things I want to tell them about. And I had a one word summary. I'd put it on a post it and put it in my pocket. Not because I was going to pull the post it out in the meeting and look at it, but because the fact that I knew it was in my pocket made me feel ashamed if I backed out of saying it. So that was helpful. So, first of all, telling yourself stories helps. Second of all, put some kind of prop that reminds you not to back off what you want to say. I think also the thing that really helped me was to think about silence seems safer. It feels safer instinctively. But if you do an ROI calculation and you because we automatically calculate the risks of speaking up.
Mhm.
But if you think about what are the risks of remaining silent over the long term, then you begin to realize that silence can actually risk the relationship, and it can create a risk for yourself, because if you always default to silence, I say this in Just Work, if you always default to silence, you lose your sense of agency, and that is the one thing none of us can afford to lose. So you want to make sure that you're remembering that, as Audre Lorde said, your silence will not protect you. Whether you're speaking up about injustice or about spinach in the teeth, there's real value in speaking up. The other thing I will say for folks who are early in their career, who maybe have to speak truth to power, there's a whole section about being radically candid with your boss. But
Yeah.
especially at this moment in time where there's a great resignation, it's so hard to hire people. Your boss is just as afraid to give you feedback as you are to give your boss feedback. And so if you can work on soliciting feedback and also giving it, you're going to have a better, not only are you going to have more success in your career, you're going to have a better relationship with your boss. And that matters.
Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think if there's one thing that is at the core of both Radical Candor and Just Work, it's the relationships that we form at work, whether it's with our boss or our peers or our employees. And you want to get on a level playing field, no matter what your position is. There are very few things that are more damaging to a relationship than a power imbalance. And so if you have the power, you want to lay it down. And if you don't have the power, you want to step it up, so that you get yourselves on a level playing field. The people I know uh, throughout my career who've wound up being the most successful were the people who were willing actually to speak truth to power. They wound up having better relationships with their boss than people who were afraid. But it's very hard to like someone who's afraid of you. So try not to take authority, formal authority, so seriously. And if you're a CEO, you want to structure things so that you strip managers of their traditional sources of power, so they don't have unilateral decision making over who gets hired, who gets fired, who gets promoted, who gets a bonus, but you do that as part of a process.
Yeah. So I like that last part that you just mentioned, and it makes me wonder because I am in that CEO role, right? And despite my company not being that big, we're around 10 people, there is an imbalance of power just
Yeah.
naturally.
Yeah.
And yes, I agree. Everyone who is like has less power, they should try to step up. But what I always try to think about, and you mentioned agency, right? I can't tell them you have to step up. What
Yeah.
I can do is to create
Lay
the
it out.
environment that they feel safe to step up, right? And so now, what would you recommend to other people that are in similar positions than I am, that are executives in organizations, etc., from a leader's perspective? What are the key messages to create a fair environment where people can just work, where you have just work?
Yeah. So if you don't design your management systems for justice, you're going to get systemic injustice. And so you want to be very conscious and you want to think, you want to bring the sensibilities that you would bring to building a product. You want to bring those sensibilities to building your company and to think about if this, then that. Like, and so, for example, I was talking to an investor in Silicon Valley and he had just read Just Work, and he said to me, you know, your book made me think. He said, I'm often the chair of the board, and so I've been thinking about all these management systems I can put in place to make sure the managers at these companies, but what if the problem is me? He said, who
Yes.
do people go to then? I'm the chair of the board. Who do people go to then? And he wound up hiring someone who would be an employee ombudsperson,
Mm.
and that was someone that the people at the company really felt they could trust. And that is really I was so grateful to him for doing that. It starts with, especially if you're the leader of a company, it starts with looking yourself in the mirror. And I will tell you a story about, at one point I started a software company, and I started this company in part as a result of that unfair situation I described at the beginning of our conversation. And also because I had another situation where I decided, oh, if I go work for a woman, then I'll get paid fairly. And then I found out once again I was being paid on, less, even when the CEO was a woman. And so I decided, if I'm the CEO, then everything will be sweetness and light, right? Then everything will be fair. And I think that's a natural human instinct. Like, if I'm the undisputed leader, then everything will be better. And it won't, unfortunately. Just because I was the boss, human nature didn't change. Surprise, surprise. I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was. So here's an example of what happened. And then I'll get to what I could have done differently. So there was a guy working for me. He bullied me. Like, I was giving him feedback and about a project that was going sideways. And I said, as I always try to do in such a situation, I said to him, what can I do or stop doing that would help you get this project back on track? And he leans in, he says, the problem here is you are the most aggressive woman I ever met. If I was the most aggressive woman he ever met, I wasn't even on the list of the top 100 most aggressive men he ever met. And furthermore, it was his job. It was an aggressive industry, and it was his job to deal with. So his problem was not my aggression. His problem was my gender. And in my case, that wasn't going to change. And so what I should have done, and what you should do as a boss, if you're in a situation and you notice bullying, I should have created consequences, either conversational consequences, you cannot talk to me or any other woman that way. I should also have created sort of compensation consequences. You're not going to get a good rating if you bully, and career compensations, career
Consequences.
consequences. So you don't want to promote your bullies if you're the boss, because if you, there's a moment in the history of every startup I've ever seen that where the bullies begin to win, and that is the moment when the culture begins to lose. So you want to make sure, like Atlassian has a really strict rule that we don't promote our brilliant jerks. You cannot get promoted if you're a jerk to other people. And sometimes you have to fire your brilliant jerks, and that's hard, because they're brilliant. But they're, if in the immortal words of Steve Jobs, it's better to have a hole than an asshole. And so you want to make sure that you're.
That's
But I didn't
brilliant.
do. Yeah, but I didn't do any of that. I didn't do any of that because because I was responding more from the position of the person harmed than the position of the leader. And so I just kind of defaulted to silence, which is too often what happens when somebody bullies us. And the problem with that was that if he was going to talk to me that way, how is he going to talk to other people, other women, the women who worked for him? And unfortunately, I had an opportunity to find out. So, fast forward a few weeks, we're at a company all hands, and there's a young woman who works for him is coming over to throw away her pizza crust in her paper plate. And he's sitting on top of a table underneath which there's the garbage can. And she says, I need to. And then he spreads his legs and he says, get in between my legs. And once again, I kind of rolled my eyes. I responded as though I were the person harmed and not the CEO, not the leader. And I kind of rolled my eyes. I pulled the garbage can out, but I did not create any consequences. And not only did I not create any consequences, I had gone to great lengths as the leader of that company to make sure that I was in control. So if she couldn't come to me, there was no one for her to go to complain. And she felt that it was an unsafe working environment. And she felt that I had created a hostile work environment. And there was no one for her to ask. I had not, unlike this investor I was just talking to you about, I had not created an employee ombudsperson. And it was a startup. There was no HR. There was nowhere for her to go. But even if there had been HR, it wouldn't have helped because HR would have reported to me, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And so you want to make sure when you're setting up your company that you're creating checks and balances. This is an old idea, and it is as important at companies as it is in governments, so that you are not the undisputed leader, so that there's always someone who people trust, who they can go to. You want to create these trusted reporting mechanisms. You want to figure out how to build a culture that cherishes the whistleblower, so that you find out what's going wrong, what you
Yeah.
yourself are doing wrong. You don't
Yeah.
want to silence feedback. You want to give the whistleblower a bullhorn.
And that's super powerful.
Where would you
Sorry, Shani, you go. Yeah.
sorry, because I'm fascinating. I love the way you talk about setting up your culture from the start so that it does that.
Yeah.
There are many companies that already have a culture that is needs changing.
Mhm.
And when as a leader you realize that you need to change the culture either because you inherited it or you created it yourself, but it's not working. Where would you start? What's how do you start to create this change and signal to people we're changing?
So I think that there are a number of things that you can do, and it depends. It depends sort of on, like, if you feel like you're in a culture where people are physically unsafe, you want to start there. You don't want to start with unconscious bias training. You want to you've got to sort of, in just work. I diagnose the different problems that you could have, but here are the
Yeah.
there are kind of six things that I think are important for leaders to do to create the conditions for just work. The first is to create sort of bias disruptors. So there's six different problems, six different solutions. I mean, there's an infinite number of problems and an infinite number, but let's boil it down to six. So bias, prejudice, and bullying, I think, are the root causes. And very often we conflate these three things as though they're one, and they're different. Bias is not meaning it, it's unconscious, kind of a brain hiccup, whereas prejudice is meaning it. It's a consciously held prejudiced belief. And bullying is just being mean. Lots more to say about all those topics, but let's now match some solutions to the problems. So for bias, I recommend bias disruptors. So Trier and I wave a purple flag. That's our bias disruptor. It's very simple, very lightweight. But there's three parts to a bias disruptor. The first is you want a shared vocabulary. You want to sit down with your team and figure out, maybe they think the purple flag is stupid and they'd rather say bias alert. One team we work with throws up a peace sign. Another team says, I don't think you meant that the way it sounded. Another team says, ouch. And so whatever it is that your the best words to use are the words your team will actually use. So talk to them. Say, what are we going to do when we want to interrupt bias? Because if we don't interrupt it, bias is a pattern. And if you don't interrupt it, it's going to get reinforced. So you've got to publicly interrupt it. The second part of bias disruptors that you can do is you can talk to your team about how to respond as the person who caused harm. So what do you say if it's you whose bias is pointed out? Because this is a hard moment for people, and you want to help people learn how to respond well. Because I don't know about you, but when my biases are pointed out to me, I feel deeply ashamed.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and usually when I feel ashamed, I don't respond well. I'm physically in a fight or flight mode. I can tell you, I feel tingling in the back of my knees, as though I have a child who's walked close to the edge of a precipice. I mean, it's a physical fear sensation. And so you want to teach people to respond when their bias has been pointed out to them, to say something like, thank you for pointing it out. I get it, and I'll try not to do it again. Or they need to say, thank you for pointing it out, but I don't know quite why what I said was problematic. Can we talk after the meeting? And the second thing is really hard, because sometimes when I'm in that situation, I feel doubly ashamed. I'm ashamed because I've harmed someone, and I'm ashamed because I'm ignorant. I don't even know what I did wrong. And so reminding people that this is normal. If we're going to learn about bias, we're going to be surprised that we've done something wrong, and we need to be open to it. And then the third part of bias disruptors is you want to make sure that you help people remember, if you get to the end of a meeting and no bias has been flagged, then you got to pause what you've done wrong to think, and where was the bias? A shared commitment to interrupting it at least once in every meeting. So in the next 13 minutes, we're going to interrupt bias at least once. That is. Can we commit to that? We're going to do it here. Okay.
Okay.
I mean, I may wave it on myself. So there's that's bias. For prejudice, you need to have kind of a code of conduct, because a bias disruptors kind of hold up a mirror for people, and when they notice the spinach in their teeth, they're naturally going to get it out. But with prejudice, that's not going to work. You're going to hold up the mirror, and the person's going to say, yeah, that's what I think. And so you need for prejudice to be very clear about where the line is. One person can believe whatever they want. It's not your job as the manager to be the thought police. So they can believe whatever they want, but they can't impose that belief on other people at the company. And you want to make it clear where that line is. So you can believe whatever you want, but you cannot refuse to hire someone because of their hair, for example, which happens, unfortunately, all the time. So I think that is really important, to sort of take the time to write that code of conduct. And then for bullying, you want to create consequences, sort of conversational, compensation and career consequences. So that's what to do for bias, prejudice, and bullying. But what happens when power enters the equation? When power enters the equation, you get discrimination, harassment, and physical violations.
Yeah.
And for discrimination, you really want to quantify your bias at every point in the employee life cycle. Who are you interviewing? And often bias creeps in just in resumes. So you can try stripping PII out of resumes, for example, personally identifiable information out of resumes.
Mm-hmm.
Who are you promoting? And you want to cut the data by your different diversity metrics, by gender, by race, by whatever it is that you're seeking to get more representation on your team. And who are you promoting? How pay? Like if you cut your pay data by gender or by race, you're going to see some. You're going to okay. I'm going to wave a purple flag. You're going to notice, not see, because if you're
That's a
blind, you
great.
will notice this.
Yeah, that was exactly in the
Yeah.
book.
You're going to notice some discrepancies. I can promise you, not because you're intending to pay women less than men, or black people less than white people, or Latino, Latina employees less than white employees, but because you're going to reflect and reinforce market bias. So you want to make sure that you're measuring what matters, that you're quantifying your bias at every stage of the employee life cycle to prevent discrimination. For harassment, you really need these checks and balances that I was talking about before.
Yeah.
And the simple ones are to make sure that no manager, including yourself, has unilateral decision making over who gets hired, who gets fired, who gets promoted, who gets paid a bonus, ratings. So again, sort of go through your employee life cycle and make sure there's no unilateral authority. And then for you want to make sure to prevent physical violations, you want to make sure that you have a culture of consent, which is not, and you want to write it down. It's not that complicated. Like if you're going to touch someone, you need to know that they want to be touched, even if it's just a handshake. And actually, a handshake is a good way to, because we're coming back in the office and some people never will shake hands again. And so, yeah, fist bump. But it's your job to know whether that other person wants to be touched. Don't just stick your hand out, but hesitate. And if you don't know, don't touch. And if they don't want to be touched, don't touch. You know, it's not that complicated. And yet, you know, it doesn't, it's not the way it works out. So those are 6 things you can do: bias disruptors, code of conduct for prejudice, consequences for bullying. You want to quantify your bias to prevent discrimination. You want checks and balances to prevent harassment. And you want to make sure that you have a culture of consent.
And it sounds like wrapping all of that means that you're actually discussing these things,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
that they're part. That
Don't,
it's not like there's a rule book or
yeah.
something, but it's
Yeah,
live.
don't do what Basecamp did, which said, we're not going to talk about politics. It's not a good idea. Or what I just recently saw, Amazon has a list of words that you're not allowed to use on the company internet. And it is a remarkable list of words. I don't know if it's really true, but if it is true, somebody needs to have, there need to be some changes at Amazon.
There need to be some consequences, some career compensation and conversation consequences.
Yeah. You're
No,
not allowed. I mean, it includes like bullying. You can't say bullying. You can't say teamwork. You can't say it's remarkable list.
so let me get into
Interesting.
one of the things that you specifically mentioned, Kim, and this is equal pay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I was very fortunate. I studied medicine and I was supposed to work in a hospital. In a hospital in Germany, at least, there are like fixed salaries for every stage.
Yeah.
So, not an issue. I didn't go work in a hospital. I joined Bain and Company as a management consultant. And there again, there are fixed salaries for every stage. And a lot of things are very transparent. So, getting into the workforce, I not only thought that I was not getting equally paid, so I always knew I was getting equal pay, but also I knew that all of my female coworkers, they were getting equal. Everybody was getting equal pay. And then you read all of these studies about like big corporations, small corporations, where this is not happening. And I don't know what the exact number is, but something around 20 to 30% is what women make in average less than men make. The last time I think I checked, maybe it's
Yeah.
even more than that, right?
Yeah. And women who aren't white get paid 40% less. Like,
40% less. So, and in the US, this becomes even more important because you have a more diverse like culture or demographics than we have in Europe, at least in Germany.
yeah.
Now, for me, this topic of equal pay always seemed to be the easiest to fix because it's very objective, right? As you mentioned, you just look at the data. You know which position people hold, you see immediately what they're making, and it should be, I'm specifically saying should be, and I'm being maybe a bit sarcastic, it should be easy to like bump up the salaries of the people that are getting less.
Mm-hmm.
What do you see as being some of the main factors that this is not happening? And it's not that people are not aware of it. A lot of women, but also men, have been talking about this for many, many years now, maybe even decades, but it still hasn't happened.
Yes.
Why?
I think part of it is denial. I think, especially in the tech sector in the U.S., but in a lot, we so believe, so firmly believe, leaders so firmly believe that this is a meritocracy, and the people we're promoting because they deserve to be promoted. The people we're paying, and it's not. I mean, that is the big lie about the about the tech sector. I think globally, it's not a meritocracy. And what happens is that for one thing, these leaders who say, we're metrics driven, blah 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 blah, and then you say, okay, let's cut the data, let's cut our pay data by gender.
Exactly.
Oh no, all of a sudden they are metrics fleeing. So part of it is a refusal to measure what matters, or to say it doesn't matter, or to say it's so complicated. I mean, these people who are like, you know, think they're going to solve the problem of mortality, think it's too complicated to pay men and women fairly. It's ridiculous. So part of it is management absurdity, denial management. Denial is not just a river in Egypt. So that's part of the problem. Another part of the problem is that people think that there's this faith that the market is fair, and we know the market is not fair. And so what happens at companies is they'll ask, and increasingly this is starting to be an illegal question, but we need to not sort this out in the legal system. We need to sort it out like by just by doing what the hospital did. I think the answer is to have different pay at different levels, and for it to be transparent, so that there's no, like, why should we negotiate our salaries? The salary should be what it is. That's what I think. But anyway, that's not what happens. What happens is you're interviewing for a job, and they'll ask you what you're currently being paid, and then they'll match that. And then they're reflecting and reinforcing the bias of the market, and they're saying, well, it's the market, it's fair. It's not fair. The market's like, let's get over this, the market is fair. That's bullshit. It's not fair. So that's part. Like, there was another executive who read Just Work, and he sent me a note, and he said, it used to be that when I would hire a woman, I'd ask her what she was paid, and I'd match that. Now that I've read your book, I ask her what her colleagues who are men are paid, and I pay her that. And so, yeah, like, how hard was that? That was not that hard. And so I think that is part of it, is being willing to be transparent. And just to, like, when I started, the one thing I got right at that company I started is that I said, okay, here are the different job categories. There's engineers, there's marketing people, there's salespeople. Here are the different levels, and here's what you're paid if you get that job. And I'm not going to negotiate it. Like, it is what it is. And because I knew that if A, I hate to negotiate, but B, I knew that the men who I hired would negotiate harder than women, not because men are better negotiators than women, but because women get punished when they negotiate. They're rational actors. That's why women don't negotiate on the way in. And then what happens? It's like
Isn't
bias.
that a prejudice?
Yes, that I mean, it's a bias, I think, because
Or a bias?
yeah, I don't think a man or a woman. I mean, it happened to me with a male boss and with a female boss, but I don't think people go in consciously saying, if it's okay for men to negotiate and it's not okay for women. I don't think most people consciously believe that. So it's not exactly a prejudice. But when a woman negotiates, she's not a team player, or she's bossy or abrasive or whatever. Like, those are all terms of bias. Whereas if a man negotiates really hard, oh, it's tough. And so he gets away with it and she gets punished for it. And that is why women don't negotiate. But then what happens is, when people give advice to women who are going in knowing, consciously or unconsciously, that this bias is out there, that they're going to get punished if they negotiate, then they get told they're wimps for not negotiating. And they're not wimps, they're rational actors. So it's like, this is the way that this kind of bias gets reflected, turns into a pay gap in the marketplace. So it's really important. I think the best answer is to make transparent. Here's the salary, here's the brackets, and here's the salaries. If you're not going to do that, don't ask people what they were paid, but figure out what the market is. And I think also, I just don't think we should I mean, it's, imagine if you had to go to the grocery store and you had to negotiate for every can of peaches you bought. Like, why should we negotiate our salaries? It should just be, it is what it is. Like, take the time to figure out a fair compensation system and pay people what's fair.
It's like going to a bazaar. I mean,
Yeah,
at least you go to a bazaar and you negotiate for every piece of candy that you buy. And if
yeah,
you're a
yeah,
good negotiator, like my mom is, and that's why I mentioned that, there can be very good female negotiators. Then
yeah.
you save a lot of money.
But it's a different context, right?
Yes,
Because
it
in the
is. Yes,
bazaar,
it is.
we're expected to negotiate, and this is what is interesting. And there's no bias against females not negotiating. There's a bunch of other biases,
Yeah.
but so it's just, again, it's a little bit of the context. It's like in our kind of sort of Western and possibly non-Western stuff, like we environments, we have this challenge, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
I actually wanted to take the conversation away to another topic that is very dear to my heart and is a little bit out of bounds from the Just Work book,
Okay.
but it's to do with the fact that I have two young boys, 9 and 10 years old, and they came up. So in early March or so, they had like International Women's Day celebration or week at school, and they came home, and one night over dinner they were saying to me, I don't get this. Why do we have a Women's Day? Why not a Men's Day? Blah blah blah. And it was, I was like, my jaw dropped, and I was like, of course. I mean, they don't they don't know what women go through yet. And I need to make sure that they are upstanders as they grow up, not just to women, but to everyone, right? Because my boys are privileged. They're white, Western European, you know, males. Like, it doesn't get any better than that for now, at least. And I'm like, what advice? I know you have kids as well, and I'd be really curious, like, what advice would you give to the parents out there, so that when we're building, we're helping this new generation of leaders and of workers to just grow, that we actually help them be really good leaders, really good upstanders, and potentially less, are less frequent perpetrators.
Yes.
And yeah.
It's really interesting. So I have twins who are 13, a boy and a girl. So I have like this little gender experiment at home going on. And so I remember at one point when my son was in kindergarten, he was taking a bath and he stuck his head out of the shower curtain and he said, "Mom, boys are smarter than girls, right?" Poor kid got it. He got a he said to me the other day, he's like, "I'll never forget that conversation." But it was, I think it was, so it was really important to me to push him hard, really hard on that. And he plays baseball. He loves playing baseball. And he has had some coaches who are wonderful, and then he's had some other coaches that that's anytime you divide the sexes, you're going to get some bias and prejudice. He's had some others who have said some really gross things, and I've responded very strongly. So I think part of it, and it was tricky to respond, because it was his coach, and I didn't want him, but I wanted him to know that it's not okay. This coach said, well, anyway, I'm not going to repeat it. It pissed me off. But I think it's really important. I think you're going to have these moments. You're going to have these moments where these kids say or do things that are problematic. But then there was another time when he came home. It was during Black Lives Matter, and he said to me, he kind of curled up in my lap and he said, "Mom, I'm so ashamed to be a white boy." And it broke my heart. And I said, "You know what, Battle?" His name is Battle. It is it's so important that you not feel ashamed of who you are. You should feel proud of who you are. And that's why it's so important to be a good upstander, to notice when things are problematic, because if you don't, you're going to feel ashamed of yourself. And that is why I think learning how to be a good upstander for, you know, I want him to do that for justice sake, but I also want him to do it for his own sake, so he doesn't feel ashamed. He doesn't get slimed by the bad behavior of a few people around him, and of the biases that are baked into our society at large.
Yeah. And I like the point that you mentioned, Kim, because I think the moment you feel ashamed, you put yourself in the position of a victim, and
Yeah,
then you don't have agency.
yeah,
Whereas if you acknowledge that you are privileged and you are okay with who you are, because it's not your fault that you have
yeah,
this privilege, but
yeah,
now you can think about what can I do with my privilege.
yeah.
And yeah, so thank you for also. I mean, I'm also a parent of three kids. The question that Shani raised was very important to me as well. Now, we're at the end of our time box, unfortunately. I think both of us could speak to you for at least another hour, but we want to be conscious of your time and appreciate very much that you took this time to spend with us, dialing in very early on, very early in the morning from where you are. So thank you for that, Kim. And I hope that we meet again at some point, maybe in real life, maybe over another interview. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed the conversation.